It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Brendan Clark-Smith, Labour MP Rosie Duffield, Guardian columnist Jonathan Freedland and Conservative councillor and former Special Advisor Anita Boateng. Today, the government starts an inquiry into claims this former minister was told her Muslimness was raised as an issue when she was sacked.
We have to look at this quickly but thoroughly, which is why the Prime Minister made the right decision to get the Cabinet Office to look at this.
It's the latest problem for Boris Johnson as he waits for Sue Gray.
The facts are there for Sue Gray to determine. I want her to do so without fear or favour. There'll be full transparency and accountability.
While all of this internecine stuff is going on, we're not seeing the big problems for our country being gripped onto.
This MP is taking his claims of blackmail by party whips to the police.
It's complete nonsense, it's attention-seeking behaviour and it's disappointing.
And most civil servants probably aren't doing this, but should they be back at the office? Let's start with a number of the paper headlines. The Daily Telegraph, first of all. Number 10, police questioned by Gray, that's Sue Gray, over parties, the civil servant who is conducting an investigation into claims of parties at Downing Street. This is the headline in The Guardian. The Prime Minister pulled into row over Tory party Islamophobia. And this finally in the Mail. Entire cabinet would back a tax hike delay. That's referring to the rise in national insurance of 1.25% coming in April. So you can see the government fighting on a number of fronts, opposition coming from within his own party in terms of Boris Johnson. Brendan Clark-Smith, can the Conservative Party be put back together again?
Well, I don't think it necessarily needs putting back together, Jo. I think we've done a lot of good things and a lot of achievements, and it's mid-term. You always have a difficult period. It's been particularly difficult, obviously, the last month or two, but I think with the Sue Gray investigation, I think the Prime Minister acting very swiftly and decisively this morning as well. I certainly think so.
Right, but this is usually the sort of stuff you expect from the opposition, but this is coming from different groups of Conservative MPs.
I think people are always disgruntled at various points, and you're never going to be able to please everybody all the time. But I think what I would say is that I think the Conservative Party's at its best when we have unity. And I think, as we saw last week with the defection, that's when we've been actually at our strongest. Right.
Rosie, do you agree with Brendan? Time isn't up for this government, actually, and the Conservative Party will unite.
Oh, I wish I shared Brendan's optimism, but I think the writing's on the wall for Boris Johnson. I think that's really clear. Not necessarily for the party, but I think when people have lost faith in the Prime Minister and don't trust him, then it's time for him to go.
Right. Can the Conservative Party be put back together again, Anita, because of the differences, the different strands that exist now within the party? The coalition that Boris Johnson was credited with bringing together does seem to be falling apart at the seams.
I'm with Brendan. I wouldn't rule out the Conservative Party or Boris Johnson just yet. I really think that this is a moment of difficulty for the party. Nobody can deny that. Whether there's a perception that some of this was own goals or whether or not there's other dynamics in the party. And look, we have to remember that this is an intake, the 2019 intake, there's 100 MPs that came in, Brendan being one of them, and they haven't perhaps had as much time in Parliament together. And I think this is a really important moment where the party gets to know one another. And I do think that, as that process happens, things will calm down. It's just always in these moments in politics, when there's a moment of peril, it feels like catastrophe. I wouldn't count the Conservatives out just yet.
Jonathan, is it too early to say that it's over for Boris Johnson?
It probably is too early because we haven't got, as we, waiting for Godot, we're waiting for that Sue Gray report. So, yeah, it's early there. And also because he does have a Houdini-like track record of escaping from political fixes, and people have written his political obituary prematurely before. So for all those reasons, you would hesitate. But look, if some of the reports that were in the weekend papers about what's in this, what Sue Gray has uncovered, particularly these interviews she's done with, we're told, police officers in Downing Street. One source told one of the papers I think this morning, that, you know, if they would be very surprised if Boris Johnson was still in his post by the end of the week, given what the police have told Sue Gray. So who knows, but it's certainly, he's never been in a tighter spot than the one he's in now.
Right, well, let's focus on a complaint that's been made by the Conservative MP Nusrat Ghani. Downing Street have today, as you heard in the headlines, asked the Cabinet Office to investigate the facts around her complaint. You can see her there, that she was sacked as a minister in a reshuffle in February 2020, in part, she says, because of her faith. Now, unusually, the Chief Whip, Mark Spencer, took the step of saying on Twitter that he was the person who spoke to her at the time and categorically denies her claim and has said it's defamatory. She's responded, Nusrat Ghani, to the news of an inquiry. We can show you here her statement. As I said to the Prime Minister last night, all I want is for this to be taken seriously and for him to investigate. I welcome his decision to do that now. The terms of reference of the inquiry must include all that was said in Downing Street and by the Whip. I look forward to seeing the terms of reference. Anita, should it have taken this long?
Well, it seems as though the Prime Minister wrote to her at the time that it happened and said, I think you should take this forward. And because now it's come out that she's gone public with it, there's been another kind of fresh impetus to look into the complaint. I mean, I was utterly shocked when I saw this, both in terms of, as someone who knows Nuz a little and knows has dealt with Mark Spencer a little, that both of these people who are people of integrity, that they have had such different accounts or claims about what that conversation was, and also as someone who's been involved in the Conservative Party and worked in the Cabinet Office, that it should come to this. But I'm really delighted that now we're kind of moving on and doing a proper, full investigation that's going to hopefully get to the bottom of this.
But Brendan, why do you think it did take so long when you think this reshuffle happened when she was sacked, Nusrat Ghani, in 2020?
Yeah, and of course ministers move on all the time for a variety of reasons, whether they're promoted, whether they're sacked, whether they just want to freshen things up a little. And obviously it's never nice for anyone when they do go through that. But I can only speak from my personal experience, certainly at the Whip's office and with the Chief Whip. That's certainly not what I would expect. And of course we have the most diverse cabinet in British history at the moment. So that's not the Conservative Party I recognise.
But why do you think she was told that it had to be a party-led investigation? That's what she was encouraged to call for, rather than what we have now, which is one led by the Cabinet Office.
Well, I think people want to establish the facts first, Jo, and again, a complaint
they could
was...
have done that immediately, couldn't they?
Well, they could have done. I think that's something else that could have been encouraged. The Prime Minister has gone on record now and said that it is going to be looked into. But again, unless an actual official complaint is made, it's very difficult to do that.
Jonathan, why do you think political parties seem to struggle to grip issues like this and often seem to respond quite defensively? You could point to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party over claims of anti-Semitism and the Tory Party over allegations of Islamophobia.
Yeah, I think the first reflex is to circle the wagons and to be defensive, and particularly to hope for or demand the right to mark their own homework. And so, you know, the internal investigation is always the preferred means, and the idea that, you know, even when informed, the impulse to say, we'll make a formal complaint, where actually people often don't want to make a formal complaint, and they feel if they've raised it the right way, then that's enough. The fear would be that it's career-ending to make the process formal, and it should be enough that you've just been told this and that you immediately say, right, we're going to get on to this properly. Instead, and I think you're right to say, this is an impulse that political parties often have. They can be very tribal, they can be very defensive, they immediately think, what's this going to look like? My hope is that actually what comes out of this is a new impulse which will make political parties think, what will it look like if it gets out that we didn't investigate this? And therefore, from now on, after this affair, hopefully all political parties will realise the best thing to do is get this out in the open, put it in the hands of somebody else outside the party and let them investigate.
Do you welcome the inquiry, Rosie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know from having been through this in my own party, the anti-Semitism crisis did slightly overshadow people who were even then talking about Islamophobia, and we really need to shine a spotlight on that now. I'm not, you know, all political parties are broad and diverse, and it just reflects society. So if someone says they've had an issue, then they've had an issue. We need to listen to them and applaud her courage in coming forward, and I really do. It can't have been easy.
Right, well, let's look at other claims that are being made against the Conservative Party. This is the BBC News headline: MP blackmail claim Tory William Ragg to meet the police. He's the head of the Public Administration Committee, and he is due to meet the police this week to complain that Conservative MPs have been blackmailed by whips, the party managers, into supporting the government. Now, Brendan, he's determined to pursue this. He clearly feels this goes way beyond a party management issue.
Well, again, Jo, I think people know how whipping works, and you have to have some form of management there, and some sort of either pastoral care, as the whips give, or persuasion, and so on. And you expect that. I think when you're talking about blackmail, that's quite a serious allegation to be making. But I'd say it's not exactly like House of Cards in the Houses of Commons. It's a little bit different from that. And I'm sure Rosie's a former whip could probably give you a bit of an insight into how whipping works as well. But I'd personally rather police spent their time looking at some of the crime in London rather than investigating members of Parliament.
Right, well, do you think it is business as usual, Rosie?
I don't recognise these stories about tarantulas and fear, but, you know, that must be very different in the Tory party. In our party, you're more likely to get a cup of tea and a stern talking to be honest. I certainly wouldn't get a tarantula and blackmailing one. But on the serious side, of course,
the
this
tarantula
needs
being
to be...
Gavin Williamson as to when he was...
Apparently, there were rumours about that.
Yes, I
don't
do.
know if that's true.
Yes,
but it does need to be taken seriously again. You know, if people are feeling really intimidated and they can't vote the way that their voters and their electorate want them to, even if it is going against party, I've rebelled, and, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. But if you really feel compelled to do that, you should be able to in good conscience, I think.
Right, but there is a difference, isn't there? And there have been discussions over the past few days about what party whips, what managers actually do. You used the word to persuade or cajole, have a pastoral role, but some of the tactics can be pretty heavy-handed. This is going a stage further. I mean, William Ragg, a senior Conservative MP, is going to the police, Brendan.
Well, I've had that cup of tea a couple of times, and I've had nothing but persuasion, I would say, and it's normally you would have things explained to you, and that again, is not the experience that I've had. And I rebelled 3 times in 1 week over Plan B recently, but I was treated respectfully throughout it. I was never threatened with anything in terms of investment or anything else like that at all. So it's not something that I recognise, but again, if the allegations are made, I don't think there's any problem with people looking into those and pursuing it through the correct channels, Jo.
Jonathan, what's your response when you heard allegations of blackmail that are being referred here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is serious. I think the most serious is the one Brendan just mentioned there, which is these threats of withheld investment. There were question marks already being raised nearly a year ago when it emerged that the £1 billion Towns Fund allocating money to small towns and assumed to be those who really needed it, 39 of the 45 towns that benefited were Conservative-held seats. Now that looks a lot like using public money to gain partisan political advantage. And if that is the case, then the notion that are you going to be one of the lucky 39? Well, you better stay on the right side of the government in the form of the chief whip and the whips. That seems at the very least worth investigation. And that was the thrust of what Christian Wakeford said last week. And I'm sure Brendan would say, well, look, you can't rely on that. He's now a Labour MP, but he was very specific about a school in his own constituency but it depended, its construction depended on him voting the right way. I think there is something really to investigate here, and the fact that, you know, whips have always twisted arms shouldn't take us away from what could be a much more serious and essentially a corruption investigation that needs to be looked at.
Brendan?
Well, what I'd say is the reason that a lot of those have gone to Conservative areas is because we won a lot of them recently in the election, and the Red Wall.
But it's
and
not
so
measured
on,
by need, because one of those was Rishi Sunak's own Richmond seat, which is by any measure a pretty comfortable seat. That didn't need money from that Towns Fund, but it got it. And so that suggests it wasn't about need and merit, it was about partisan affiliation.
OK, Jonathan, I can give you 2 examples there. So Christian Wakeford, who we mentioned, Christian got £20 million for Radcliffe in his constituency. He rebelled a number of times on that. I'd contrast that with me. I've not really rebelled that much. I'm in a Category 1 area, and I didn't get the funding. So it also is on the strength of the application as well. I mean, in my case, you know, my council unfortunately submitted their bid late. I think it happened in Bolton, a Conservative-controlled council as well. So there's no preferential treatment there. And there's a lot more factors there. And civil servants look at these, they have their boxes that they've got to tick, the criteria that you've got to have there. So I think there's more at play, really, than just members of Parliament and their voting record.
Right. I mean, just to say the local council disputes what you have just said there, Brendan. They say they did submit the application for funding ahead of the deadline and that they received an email receipt of acknowledgement.
Well, I asked the Minister this question, Jo. I had a written question in Parliament of it, and I was told that it was late. I've also subsequently been told that files have not been attached. I'm happy to wait for the Freedom of Informations to come out with that. But I think the main thing is that the department, who I've been lobbying quite extensively since, they've said they're going to give us feedback on that bid. They're going to work with us, and we're going to have another chance in the spring to do it. So
right.
I would hope we can work together and actually really get that money, because we need it.
Right. Well, let's investigate a little bit more some of the things that Jonathan has said, and also the Labour MP, Rosie Chris-Bryant, chairman of the Common Standards Committee, who said that the levelling up funds that have been introduced in the last 2 years are an open opportunity for government ministers to corruptly hand out money to some MPs and not to others. Do you think there's evidence of that?
I don't know about evidence, but I think it raises a really interesting point. Jonathan mentioned the seats that have been given the Levelling Up Fund, or sort of, the opportunity to bid. But so was I, and that's because my seat is in a very marginal seat. I don't care why I'm getting the money, so long as we do, because we need it in Canterbury. But yeah, that is a really good point. We have to be transparent about where that money goes to.
Because Boris Johnson promised voters that he'd level up, didn't he? You've just given your example there of your area. I mean, what is corrupt about that? What is corrupt about then
on the surface,
giving money
nothing.
to areas that are going to be levelled up?
Absolutely nothing. But I think it's a sort of interesting form of gerrymandering, isn't it? Kind of who's going to look at, where are we going to get those MPs? If my Tory council and my county council get to say we've transformed Canterbury, then of course they have more chance in the elections of looking good. So, but again, we need the money. I'm happy to take it. So.
Anita?
Well, I think that the reality of politics is that, as Brendan says, lots of factors go into where money goes. And that is about funding, that's about the application, that's about the specific benefits it would provide. It could also be about the pressure and engagement from local councils and from MPs. And I'm a local councillor, I'm in a Labour-run administration, I will ask for things, I'm unlikely to get them. And part of that's going to be about the strength of relationships and about lobbying and about how much time you take to build a case. But I think it's a lot more complicated than most people would consider when decisions are being made about allocating funds.
Jonathan?
The trouble is, I think the government has a credibility problem in this area. The notion that funds are only allocated on merit, that has been undermined partly because of the whole handling of COVID funds and those PPE contracts. We had a ruling from the High Court just the other day saying that at least 2 were handed out unlawfully and through this so-called VIP lane, the high priority lane, which essentially went to chums and ideological allies and those with contact of the government. And, we just heard the other day that £4.3 billion has been written off in COVID funds that were handed out fraudulently. So we know that actually there are criteria deployed here that are not just merit. They are partly about who you know and whether you're in with this government. And that's happened in the PPE funds. And therefore, that's why people are going to look at something like this small town fund the same way.
Anita?
But Jonathan, really, fundamentally, I mean, you gave a perfect example there of the £4.3 billion that has come out through kind of fraud and that kind of thing. And what happened there was really the Treasury being very, very keen to get funds to people as soon as possible and not creating lots of artificial barriers to receiving funds. So you can read it in a bad faith way, or you can read it, both PPE, this situation, as a genuine attempt to use the machinery of government in a really complicated and fraught time to get money out to people that really needed it. And so if you don't support the government, you're not likely to come on board as a result of this. If you do, you might give them more leeway.
Jonathan?
No, that would be fine if you absolutely had to get money out the door to buy PPE. That would be fine. But why was that money out the door to people who had ministerial or MP contact? Why did a high priority lane exist for people who had mates in government? We know about, the publican for Matt Hancock, who suddenly had no track record in this field, suddenly is a company he was involved in receiving billions and billions, or millions and millions rather, of pounds of public money. The argument for urgency doesn't mean you have to have priorities given or prioritised cronies, and that's what happened.
Well, I think this is all going to be unpicked in the public inquiry, but what is clear is there was an intention to get things to happen as quickly as possible and a frustration with the way that it was taking too long, and I think that was an important dynamic in some of those decisions.
Right, let's go back to the issue of levelling up specifically, because there is new research out from More in Common, finding that making a success of levelling up is the Prime Minister's last chance to turn things around with voters, according to their survey and research based on polling 4,000 people and focus groups across the Red Wall, seats in those former Labour constituencies. Luke Trill from More in Common joins us now. What do you say about the results, the findings of your research, that this is Boris Johnson's final chance to repair the damage with those voters?
Well, thank you for having me. You're right. The research shows very clearly that the PM is in last chance saloon when it comes to the voters, and trust in this government has collapsed. When I spoke to you last time I was on the show, I gave the finding that 2/3 of people thought that the UK system was rigged. That figure in the wake of Partygate has now risen to over 80%. So we've been trying to find out what might turn things around, what might restore trust in government. And the answer that came back really strongly was the levelling up policy. It's really had kind of amazing cut through with the public, and people talk in quite animated and passionate terms about what it means for them and their area. And they agree with the government's diagnosis that their areas, their communities have been left behind for a long time. But what they now want to start seeing is that delivery on actually giving a levelling up policy to the country, and that involves making sure that their parks are in better conditions. It means restoring local high streets. It means tackling crime and antisocial behaviour. That's what this government needs to do if it's going to have the reset with voters. And they perhaps need to move away from some of the other Operation Red Meat stuff around the licence fee or where you process migrants, because that just doesn't cut it. What people really want to see to restore their faith in government, to show that government cares, is that we're investing in their communities, in the things which matter in their everyday lives.
And if the Prime Minister and the government don't deliver in the way these voters expect, is there any indication of where they will go politically?
Yeah, so people are definitely giving Keir Starmer and the Labour Party a second look. Lots of these voters abandoned the Labour Party in 2019. They're now saying that actually they'll decide between the Conservatives and the Labour Party on the basis of levelling up. In fact, 7 in 10 of Red Wall voters say that levelling up will be a key decider in terms of who they vote for. But Labour isn't quite there yet and needs to do a bit more to set out their vision for community regeneration. There's also a more worrying undercurrent in some of the focus groups that we've spoken to, that people are fed up with mainstream politicians failing to deliver in general and actually are starting to look elsewhere. And our worry is that if that promise of levelling up, which has really raised expectations about improving deprived communities, isn't delivered, people will start to look outside the mainstream for more populist alternatives, whether that's the Reform Party, whether that's another Nigel Farage reboot. This really is last chance saloon, and it's not just about the Prime Minister and one party. It's about all politicians in the UK, showing that democracy really does deliver for the whole country.
Luke Trill, thank you very much. Brendan, you feeling nervous listening to all that, sitting there at your seat? It sounds existential.
I'm going to disagree with some of that, Jo, actually, because whilst I think it's important levelling up and it's something I'm very passionate about, it's not actually just about throwing money at things. I don't knock on the door and they'd say, we need a new tram system or we must desperately throw all this money at the town centre. A lot of it's about pride in your area again. It's about being positive about it. And I think we have to remember at the election when a lot of these people came over to us, I'd still say the number one issue in my inbox at the moment again, is the small boats. Now, I'm in Bassetlaw in North Nottinghamshire. We know we're near the coast. Yeah. Immigration's very low in the area. This is the number one issue because they see it as tying in with taking back control, and it's linked to Brexit. Now, a lot of those people that came over to us, they're culturally conservative, but for historical reasons, they wouldn't vote for us for one reason or another. Now, Brexit was the trigger for that. And I think a lot of people are very frustrated if they don't see that control being taken back. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want, say, that the 17 million we've had in a hospital, or we don't want a better town centre, or we don't want more police and so on. Of course people do, but I think it's a little more nuanced than that. And I think that is probably people's bigger frustration. So it's a combination of the two, but I think it's those cultural conservatives and showing that we still really can do what we said we did at the election, which is bring them with us and keep them with us.
Luke, do you want to respond to that?
Well, look, I think Brennan's right that it's not just about flashy new projects. It is about that everyday, that pride in place, that sense of being in the up. But I think voters are a lot more savvy than occasionally politicians give them credit for. They're not easily distracted by, repeating the same announcements on how we're going to deal with channel crossings, even if it's an issue of concern. What really matters to most people is it is that everyday. It's the park around the corner. It's the local high street in places like Bassetlaw where we've spoken to people. They want to see those changes, and that's the lens through which they view whether government is working for them or isn't.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Luke Trill. We've heard from the Prime Minister this morning. He has been interviewed. We're just going to play you his response to questions about the Nusrat Ghani inquiry.
We take these allegations extremely seriously. I took them very seriously when they were raised with me 18 months ago. Very glad there's an investigation taking place now. Can't say more really about it.
Oh, well, that was short and maybe sweet. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens with the investigation. Let's talk about Brexit, brought up there by Brendan. I want to just show you this tweet from the leader of the Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg. It says there at the top, the Remoniacs are undaunted, he says. Now, this is his response to an interview from last week in which the former Conservative Deputy Prime Minister, you can see there, Lord Michael Heseltine, says he believes Brexit could be undone if Boris Johnson is forced to quit. Now, I know we've been discussing endlessly the future of the Prime Minister. At the moment, there is no leadership challenge or vacancy. But, Brendan, just looking at the statement, is what Lord Heseltine says far-fetched? Brexit could be undone if
well,
he's
this
forced to quit.
What Lord Adonis said as well. I think his tweet said something like, if Boris goes, Brexit goes. And I think that's they're not doing themselves any favours with this because there's a backlash to it. And really, there's a saying that we're all Brexiteers now. There are a lot of people who voted Remain. They want to make the best of it. We want to push this global Britain. And we want to be positive, really. It's not about looking back. It's about looking forwards and making the best of what we've got, really, and making it work for everybody. So I don't think this is really helpful.
Jonathan, are we all Brexiteers now?
Well, you can't count me into that, but no. I understand the idea, the democratic argument, which is now it has been settled as an immediate question. I do think it does, politically, it is probably a mistake if Michael Heseltine wants to see the back of Boris Johnson, then saying this is likely to rally pro-Brexit MPs around him rather than to push him out the door. And it's why I think Jacob Rees-Mogg wanted to highlight those remarks, because that is a play that the pro-Boris Johnson camp can make, which is to say, look, if you jeopardise Johnson, if you get rid of him, then you're going to jeopardise Brexit. I don't think that's possible. I think that's plausible, that just by losing Boris Johnson, there's suddenly going to be a second referendum. None of Johnson's likely replacements, Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, is about to call a second referendum. If anything, actually, I would say this, that Boris Johnson was the one person, as the big campaigner for Vote Leave, he was the one person who actually had some leeway to, if he wanted to get a little bit closer to Europe, or, for example, to meet Brussels halfway on the Northern Ireland Protocol. He had the credibility as Mr. Brexit to do that, whereas any of his successors will have much less room for manoeuvre. Someone like Liz Truss, who I think voted for Remain, would not feel that she has the kind of cash in the bank or political capital with pro-Brexit MPs to wiggle at all. So actually, I think if you're in the Heseltine camp, probably the end of Boris Johnson should make you even more dispirited from that angle. But either way, it's going to make troops rally behind him. So probably not politically that savvy.
Right. But if we think about what Jonathan has just said in terms of what the impact a change of leadership might have, interesting that he actually thinks Boris Johnson had more capital, actually, in terms of a slightly closer relationship with Europe. But do you think a change, if he were to go, that there might be a change in approach towards the idea of Brexit and issues like the Northern Ireland Protocol?
I mean, I think there's two very distinct questions there about the approach to Brexit itself I don't think so. I really believe, I'm someone who's very open-minded to like what if political histories. There is no scenario I can foresee in which we end up in a second referendum or any of the major tenets of Brexit being unpicked by any Conservative leader. As to the question of the Northern Ireland Protocol, I think that's a little different just because we've got this, huge thing coming down the tracks, which is the Northern Irish elections, which is going to be a major factor in determining how the negotiations over the protocol shake out.
Rosie?
Yeah, well, as one of those Romaniacs, obviously I wish that Andrew Adonis was right, and it would be great if I thought that there was a chance of going back for a second referendum. And it just highlights the difference between my seat and someone like Brendan's. We talk about the small boats, they're literally in my backyard. We've got a very different attitude. So all of these things, levelling up fun, the country is so divided, I think, and it's really fascinating. But certainly my Remain voters, we were a majority Remain seat, would love to have another stab and to see if we can renegotiate it, because my neighbours are in France. I have people that commute and people that have never been to Bassetlaw, for example, but go to France all the time.
Right.
So I wish that was true.
Well, and you're very clear about where you stand. I mean, in an interview a year ago, you said that Labour MPs, not just you, but other colleagues, are desperate to rejoin the EU at heart and haven't given up on EU membership. Is that still the case with your colleagues?
I think less so. I think we've been distracted by so much else, actually. And I wouldn't agree that everyone is a leaver now at all and everyone's pro-Brexit, but certainly I think the party has thought, well, we've got to kind of move on. And there's a few of us just left going, how about Kent?
I mean, are you disappointed by Keir Starmer saying that, we need to make Brexit work?
Well, I am, as a Kent MP. I'm the only Kent MP, and of course all these lorry queues have been happening in my back garden, literally the Garden of England, all weekend. And if we want to win a Labour government, we're going to have to pay attention to seats like mine and seats like Kent and the effects of Brexit, which hit us directly. So yeah, I'm a bit disappointed in that. But I understand he's trying to get the Red Bull seats back. And like I said, it's a very different offer across the country. So it's a difficult one.
Brendan, Peter Bone, a Conservative colleague of yours, says if the Prime Minister goes, we might end up with a leader that shadows the EU and doesn't take advantage of our newfound freedom. So in contrast to what Jonathan has said, do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think Prime Minister's going anywhere. But what I would say is that I think if you look at the team, and I did say we're all Brexiteers now, I think anybody wanting to be the leader of the Conservative Party wouldn't want to go against the Democratic vote and wouldn't want to go against the rest of the majority of their party either. And certainly what I see in the Parliamentary Party is a lot of support for what we're doing generally and no desire at all to row back on things. And as we said with the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment, Liz Truss has negotiated a lot of trade deals around the world. And as I said, she voted Remain, but has done a great job with that and is doing a great job with negotiations now.
And that is about trading relationships between Northern Ireland and GB as well as the EU. Jonathan, I'm just showing everybody your article in The Guardian last week. The headline is "This Scandal Reveals a Conservative Party Corrupted by Boris Johnson and by Brexit." What did you mean exactly?
Well, I think the Conservative Party changed in the process of Brexit and became something much more like a national populist party and less in the business of conserving. And you think about some of the things it's been ready to attack, whether the union. I mean, this was the Conservative and Unionist Party, and then you saw Jacob Rees-Mogg calling the leader of the Scottish Conservatives a lightweight. You saw that polling where, Conservative members said they would be happy to let Scotland break off, Northern Ireland to break off, if that was the price of Brexit. That wasn't a Conservative position. And similarly, even with, I think the attack on the BBC seems to me very small c Conservative. The BBC is a 100-year-old institution. The Conservative Party used to be in the business of conserving things. Brexit filled it with a kind of revolutionary fervour, the kind of things that Conservatives didn't used to like, big ideas, theoretical, abstract nouns. It was a very, very different party now, I think.
Right. Well, you use that phrase, national populist party. You make a comparison with Viktor Orban in Hungary. I mean, just to give you some of the examples of what Viktor Orban has done, Hungary doesn't recognise gay marriage. Viktor Orban has said we do not want to see a significant minority among ourselves that has different cultural characteristics and background. We want to keep Hungary as Hungary. Can you really make that comparison with Boris Johnson?
Well, the comparison was quite specific, which was about the channeling and funneling of funds and public jobs to ideological allies. So the notion of imposing Paul Dacre as the regulator of the media as head of Ofcom was a classic Orban move. But no, I would say, yes, you can make the comparison. Remember, we've got a prime minister, we were talking about Islamophobia earlier, who compared women in burqas to bank robbers and letterboxes. You know some of the racist language Boris Johnson's used in the past, talking about black Africans with their watermelon smiles, calling them pickaninnies. So Saeed Avasi and others have been talking about Islamophobia in the Tory party for quite a long time. Didn't get really a hearing until perhaps this weekend with the Nuskani revelations. But I don't think the comparison, specifically in terms of that financial and patronage corruption, I don't think it's completely wide of the mark.
Is it wide of the mark, Anita?
Well, Jonathan doesn't like Boris Johnson or the Conservative Party, and I don't think on this programme I'm going to be able to win him over. I think the fundamental question about the Conservative Party is I always feel as though people that aren't Conservatives tend to use this argument that your job is just to keep everything the same if you're a Conservative. I think there's a deep well of philosophical Conservative thought that is committed to things like small state and good governance and clear threads that run through the entirety of the 20th century that I won't bore you with right now. And I do think there is a consistency to understanding and articulating the voice of the majority of the population that means the Conservative Party is the most popular party in British history, some argue in the world. And I really think that part of the issue, let me finish, just part of the issue with Brexit was there was an absolute majority in this country for not continuing our membership. And what the Conservative Party did, and it was painful for the party, was understand that, recognise it, and allow the country to move forward with a different vision and a different relationship to Brexit. I do not think that's unconservative.
Jonathan?
I was just going to give one example, which is it conceivable to imagine the Conservative Party of old, even if there was no pandemic, actually, having a party in the basement of Downing Street on the eve of a royal funeral? The idea of respect and dignity for the monarchy would have been such a basic Conservative impulse. It would have been a reflex. As I say, without any COVID restrictions, it would have been unimaginable. Yet today's Conservative-run Downing Street thought that wasn't a problem. There was no issue even in their minds that on the eve of the Queen burying her husband, they were partying and bringing drink in by the suitcase. That, to me, shows something culturally has changed in this party. It doesn't have the reverence for institutions, even the monarchy, even the Queen, that it would once have defined it and in which it would have once taken great pride.
Anita?
Well, there's a reason why the Conservative Party has been so shocked and taken so seriously these allegations, and we'll have to wait till the Sue Gray report, everyone take a drink, I've said it, comes out until we see the specifics of exactly what happened with that. I completely agree with you that it's a remarkable turn of events, but I would say there's a difference between Number 10 and the rest of the Conservative Party and the majority of my association and fellow councillors who probably did feel the way that you felt about finding out about that party before, alleged party before the Queen's husband's funeral.
All right, we're going to show you this headline here. It's a press release, actually. Civil servants to lead the way in returning to offices. Cabinet Office Minister calls for government departments to accelerate the return to office-based working to boost staff collaboration and help support local businesses. This is Steve Barclay writing to permanent secretaries, telling them that the end of Plan B COVID regulations now means every desk should be filled. We should be returning to normal pre-pandemic arrangements. Is he right?
I think he's absolutely right, yeah. And I enjoyed the time I spent at home with my family and working from home. It doesn't always work for everybody, but it's about leading by example. And this is going on what Anita was talking about before, and talking about what's gone up in Number 10 again. It's leading by example. And I think seeing people back at work, seeing those offices populated again, seeing all those businesses that rely on people going into the office. And there's a big chain of this here. And whilst I think there's been some good changes there with people using online, people using technology, people adapting, really we're in a people business, Joe. And I think, you can't do that on a Zoom conversation. Sometimes actually that interaction, we're human beings, that's what we're all about.
Do you agree with Brendan?
Yeah, to a certain extent, but I don't think anyone should feel pressured to come back. And there was the WHO representative yesterday on Sunday morning BBC show saying that we are, in this country, really racing ahead to kind of let go of the restrictions, actually, she thinks, ahead of time. So I think we still need to be really cautious. We've been told by Sage, haven't we? Chris Whitty said this is around for another 18 months or so. And he said that at Christmas. So long as staff don't feel pressured and that they're genuinely feeling safe and OK to do so. My team and I love doing all the Zooms. times. You know, we're all over the country, actually. I've got someone working for me who lives in Cumbria, and it works completely brilliantly. You know, we're fine with that. We've got to adapt, haven't we?
Right, but I mean, you say you don't feel staff should be pressured. This sounds like an instruction, certainly from Steve Barclay. He wants the figures on the number of staff, civil servants who've returned to Whitehall by the end of next week so he can report back to the Prime Minister. Is it important that civil servants lead by example?
To a degree, but yeah, they've got to feel safe. They're human beings as well. You know, Parliament's still sort of on this weird hybrid kind of system. So as long as there is regular testing, we can get tests, we know everyone's had their jabs and their boosters, then OK, but we need to do things slowly, don't we, so that we are safe.
Right. I mean, Jonathan, one of the reasons that has been put forward by Steve Barclay and others is about the economy, that actually it is hitting the economy hard, particularly city centres, by the very fact that so many people are not travelling in and out to work. What do you say in response to that?
Yeah, I can see that argument very much for city centres. My worry would be that I'm not sure this is something you can force people to do. I mean, the technology has shifted. In some ways, COVID has accelerated something that was happening anyway. And even if it means there's going to be a very big change in how we live, so that it actually, the thriving high streets are not in city centres, but rather in the sort of smaller towns or suburbs where people live, I don't know. I think there are losses involved in people not being in offices together, face-to-face and sharing. There are also, though, those gains that Rosie was talking about, where people can live these more flexible lives and they can be with family and take on other responsibilities. So I think probably coercion isn't going to do it because the society is changing and technology has made that change possible.
Right. I mean, this issue of coercion is interesting, Anita, but also the FDA union has said that 41% of civil servants surveyed, admittedly in January last year, said they're more effective working from home, and the world of work has changed.
Yes, and I think what we're talking about here is really government. And government doesn't work as well, I would say, certainly Whitehall doesn't work as well with much more remote working. It's just there's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of kind of bringing together of people that can work very, very well when you're all in a room together. But at the same time, just to say, I think civil servants have been working enormously hard through this entire pandemic. And I think it's really important that we recognise that. And that, like, and it does mean for lots of people that the number of hours they work have actually been extended. So I think there's a difference between working effectively and working really hard. And no one is saying the civil service haven't worked tremendously hard.
Well, maybe not the people you're talking to, but your colleague, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, former Conservative Party leader, says the signal this sends to the rest of the country is do as we say, not as we do, if civil servants don't return to the office. The civil service is in a mess because first they had flexi time, then they had lockdown, and now they all think they can work from home and ride their Peloton exercise bikes. I don't mind flexi time to a degree, but this is flexi holiday. Is that fair?
I don't think it's fair on people who've been working very hard at home, but at the same time I can understand the point that Sir Ian's making there, because certainly with me, I like to be in Westminster, and I think one of the unusual things is that we seem to have had all these very different rules in Parliament that actually haven't been happening in the rest of the country, and I think that's when people get very frustrated, you know, when things are closed, or when there's only one of you on a table, or it's masks in that place and it's not masks in this place, and it's just that consistency, and I think the last few weeks have actually shown us that fairness and actually having things the same across the board actually means something.
Right. Well, Jonathan, I don't know if you've got a Peloton bike there, but I mean, do you think that's fair on civil servants from Ian Duncan-Smith?
No, I thought that is not fair. And I think people actually have worked extremely hard. I mean, we should obviously stress there's a lot of people who don't have the option of working from home. A whole lot of workers whose work requires them and required them all through the pandemic to go into, obviously, hospitals, but factories and fields, and just physical work that was just made impossible, people delivering things, etc. That said, I think the people who work from home, a lot of them worked harder than ever they had before, and they saw no boundary between their work life and their home life. They were expected to answer emails all hours of the day and night. I think people have worked really hard through this two-year period.
Just briefly before we go, Anita, what happens if civil servants just say, no, we're not coming back?
I think the majority will come back, and I think it will just be some more flexible working moving forward.
All right, thank you for that. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests today, but I will be back at the same time with Politics Live at 12:15. Please join me and my guests then. Bye-bye.